Hello, my name is Heather Reynolds. I am a local historian, independent researcher, and freelance writer. I want to thank both Ryan and Matthew for inviting me to participate in the Oxford Local History Day this afternoon. Since 2000, I have written and conducted research on Black history in Oxford County. Since 2005, I have conducted presentations with my exhibit, Almost Forgotten, Black History in Oxford County. I have a short PowerPoint presentation on Oxford County's brief Black history. Black history in Oxford County includes Black settlements in Ingersoll, Woodstock, and Norwich Township, which consist of Norwich, Milldale, and Otterville. Oxford County was home to a number of Black communities that have since disappeared and are almost forgotten. The Underground Railroad and escaping slaves smuggled out of slavery and free Black settlers are commemorative in various parts of Oxford County. These past Black settlements included Ingersoll, Wesley Methodist Church, British Episcopal Church, the Daly House and John Brown, which we will discuss. Woodstock consisted of the BME Church, also known as Hawkins Chapel or Park Row Community Chapel, George Garvey, aka George Washington Jones. Norwich Township, we'll talk about Frederick Stouffer, Samuel Jones, the first registered Black landowner. And in Otterville, we'll talk about the African Methodist Episcopal Cemetery, the Cincinnati riots of 1829. Ingersoll. Located in the heart of southwestern Ontario in Oxford County, Ingersoll was incorporated on January 1st in 1852. During 1851 to 1861, Ingersoll had a large Black population. It was second only to Chatham in the size of its Black community during the mid-1800s. During that time, Ingersoll's population was about 2,000. Of that number, about 400 were Black. Ex-slaves volunteered their labor in 1854 to build the former Wesley Methodist Church on Oxford Street, as thanks for their kindness shown to Black people arriving in Ingersoll. Many Blacks were skilled in building trades like bricklayers, plasterers, and roofers. The church consisted of a 3-story brick building with living quarters for the minister on the top floor, and it could seat 500 people. Pine boards in the attic measured 12 to 14 inches wide, indicated the size of the white pine trees that inhabited Oxford County at that time. The Wesley Methodist Church was the first public building in Ingersoll to have electricity, and it was the most southerly terminus of the Underground Railroad for southwestern Ontario. Led by Quakers of the Way of St. Thomas, slaves escaping bondage from their plantations from Virginia, Georgia, Louisiana, and even as far as New Orleans were smuggled into the attic of the Ingersoll Church during the night. Anti-slavery supporters would try to find work for them on Oxford County near farms, or would transport them to other areas to work to enable them to safely reach their destinations. Not only was the church a haven for escaping slaves, but Black people were also involved in the choir. The fiery American anti-slavery supporter John Brown preached at the church in April of 1858. During Ingersoll's fire of 1872, the Wesley Methodist Church was badly scorched, but was repaired. However, a second fire in 1956 destroyed the church. In 1965, the Wesley Methodist Church was destroyed to make room for a car wash. Today, no remnants exist to indicate the role Ingersoll once played in aiding slaves to freedom. Due to the large population, Black Ingersoll residents wanted their own church and built the British Episcopal Church, the BME Church, in 1858. Also called the Negro Church, the BME Church was erected on the south side of Catherine Street on the east side of the stream, located near where many of the Blacks had lived. In addition, many Black people were buried in the Ingersoll Rural Cemetery, as well as in Potter's Field. The church was built like a barn. Boards were up and down, and slots covered cracks. Reverend Solomon Peter Hale was the last minister of the BME Church. He died in Ingersoll in 1904. In 1933, the BME Church was sold to R. Cuthbert of Sweberg, who demolished the building and used the lumber to build a hog pen. No known picture of the BME Church exists. The Daly House or Ingersoll Inn was also associated to the Underground Railroad. On April 15, 1858, John Brown scheduled a meeting with Harriet Tubman at the Daly House. However, she did not appear. The following day, John Brown wrote a letter to his wife and children dated in Ingersoll, Canada West on April 16, 1858. That letter was mentioned in the 1891 book, Life and Letters of John Brown, Liberator of Kansas and Martyr of Virginia, 32 years after his passing. The Daly House was located at the corners of King Street West and Oxford Street, right across the street from the Wesley Methodist Church. Legend had it that a tunnel joined the Wesley Methodist Church to the inn, while escaping slaves holding out in the church could be brought out through the Daly House by this tunnel. However, when the Daly House was demolished in 1994, no traces of a tunnel could be found. Unbeknownst to most Canadians, Canada played a significant role in Harper's Ferry massacre in Virginia in October 1859. John Brown, the American anti-slavery supporter, toured Chatham and Ingersoll on the premise of drumming up money and men to free slaves in the South. However, the Friday American was evasive on his true intentions. 100 years after these events, documents revealed that Brown had planned the raid on Harper's Ferry well over a year. Brown knew there was a large Black populations in Chatham and Ingersoll, and he traveled by the Great Western Railroad to those places. While in Ingersoll, Brown was given 5 prospective names of Ingersoll men for his Army of Liberation. They were Gernard Hughes, Charles Hall, Joshua Bailey, Peter Pendleton, William Bailey, and John Thompson. Whether any of these men participated in Harper's Ferry is not known. On October 16, 1859, Brown became headline news. In an attempt to establish a stronghold for escaped slaves, Brown led a raid against a government aerosol at Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. John Brown was hanged for treason on October 2, 1859. This incident sparked the fuse to cause the American Civil War 16 months later. Woodstock, Ontario. In 1888, the British Episcopal Church, also known as Park Row Community Chapel, and Hawkins Chapel, named after the Right Reverend Walter Hawkins, the first minister, was built on Park Row in Woodstock. During the 1800s, the church serviced about 75 Black families and was one of the few Black churches in the community. The last burial service held at the church occurred on January 15th in 1937 for Samuel Walter Smith, a long-time standing Black family in Woodstock. After being closed for 6 years, Reverend George Boyce took over the church in July of 1977 and reopened it a year later as Park Row Community Chapel. To show that the church was open for any race, it was painted black and white. Reverend Boyce baptized Kevin James Mitchell of Stratford, son of Ray and Cecile Mitchell, Maple Smith's daughter, on February 6, 1978, during the church's reopening. The child was the 4th generation of the Smith family to be baptized in the church before it was closed. The church was once the Center for Blacks in Woodstock until it was permanently closed in 1986. Now it's a residential home. Woodstock was also home to the famous, well-liked but unofficial town crier, George Garvey. For a quarter of a century, this well-known figure was popular among Woodstock streets. In 1925, George Garvey arrived in Woodstock and appointed himself as the city crier. The people of Woodstock nicknamed him George Washington Jones, a name he did not care for, but one that stuck with him nonetheless. George became immortalized in 1994 in a song composed for him, as well as in August of 2004 after a walkway was named in his honor. Dressed in a silk top hat, swallowtail top coat, bedecked in various medals, badges, and flags, and a sandwich board and megaphone, George Garvey paraded up and down Dundas Street, advertising hockey and baseball games and local events like dances, the Lions Carnival, the Woodstock Fair, and the Rotary Bingo. On December 8, 1951, George Garvey died at the house's refuge. His friends arranged a proper funeral, and he was buried in the Baptist Cemetery in Woodstock. Famous businessmen were his pallbearers. In 1952, the same friends, spearheaded by the late Percy Canfield, took up a collection and erected a headstone that read, George Jones, 1856 to 1951, town crier. Norwich Township. Norwich was another early settlement in Black history. It is reported that Black people settled in Norwich Township as early as 1829, and it is Norwich Quaker Frederick Stouffer. The Quakers assisted Blacks in Cincinnati after the Cincinnati riots of 1829, when a white mob destroyed businesses, burned residents and other structures, and assaulted Black residents. As a result, many Blacks left Cincinnati to settlements in Canada, excuse me, and Stouffer was a land agent. Many of the Black settlers had the means to purchase property. They were pioneers who helped clear the land, built sawmills, schools, and churches, and developed the communities enjoyed by immigrants of every race and color. For an example, the first registration of land ownership by a Black settler was Samuel Jones, who purchased Lot 16, Concession 7 in Norwich in 1833. In 1842, the village SS number 18 school was attended exclusively by Black students. The school was a log cabin, 15 feet by 20 feet, and it was situated on a property that owned by a Black settler named Charles Joyner, who also ran a sawmill in the area. Records indicated that in 1853, 41 students attended the school that consisted of 24 boys and 17 girls. When Norwich Township was split into North and South Norwich in the 1850s, the schools were rearranged and number SS number 18 disappeared. An example of how affluent some of these Black families were in this area is illustrated through a photo album kept by the Williams family. A wine-colored velvet photo album contains studio portraits of the Williams family. This album is quite unique as it is a music box. This album is at the Norwich Museum. Robert Williams settled his family on a small farm located on Lot 6, Concession 7 in Mealdale, Ontario. He and his wife Harriet had 9 children. 4 were born there. As members of the Mealdale United Church, Robert and Harriet are buried in the Mealdale Cemetery. Audible was another important area in Black history in Oxford County. Land was purchased here in 1856. 5 years later, Black slaves built a church and named it the African Methodist Episcopal Church. This name was later changed to the British Methodist Episcopal Church. Although no picture exists, the church was described as a white frame structure that became debt-free by 1864. Up until the early 1900s, large meetings called camp meetings were held at the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Audible. Many people, both Black and white alike, attended these meetings, traveling from Ingersoll, Tillsonburg, Brantford, and even as far as Windsor. A Black preacher from Woodstock, Reverend Lucas, would sometimes speak at these meetings. The church is long gone, and the area that was used as their cemetery is now covered by trees and unmarked grave sites. Nevertheless, a plaque was erected in 1982 to commemorate the British Methodist Episcopal Church and the Black settlement in Norwich Township. Despite these 4 locations of early Black settlements, the Carn in Audible is the only commemorative monument in Oxford County that acknowledges Black settlements in this area. There are still many missing pages to Black settlements in Oxford County. I'm just going to show this quick video. In it, there's a curator from the Norwich, Ian Bell is there, and Joyce Pettigrew, who's a local Audible historian, and she's also the author of the book, the Black Settlements that she wrote. So I'm just going to start the video.
One of Governor Simcoe's most notable achievements was the limitation of slavery. Simcoe passed legislation that allowed for gradual abolition. Slaves already in the province would remain enslaved until death, but no new slaves could be brought into Upper Canada, and children born to female slaves would be freed at age 25. This effectively ended all slavery by 1810. The first Black citizens of Oxford came up with Peter Lossing and the Quakers. Many stopped in a little community south of Norwich known as Otterville.
In the days before the Civil War, from Mississippi right up to New York State and Pennsylvania, it was the Quakers, to a large extent, who helped organize and provided safe houses along the Underground Railway.
The first blacks that came here were free blacks from New York State, and they had money when they came and purchased the land. One landowner, Jones, was able to purchase 150 acres, for instance, which was a fair-sized tract.
And then there was the mill that was in Otterville too. So a lot of the blacks that were associated in Norwich probably moved into Otterville because of the employment.
It wasn't a separate settlement. It wasn't a case of escaped slaves on this side of the creek, everybody else on the other. They were mixed in with the community. You couldn't particularly tell by going past somebody's house whether it was a Quaker house or whether it was a black house or whether it was an Irish house or anything. It was, everybody was pretty much there together on an equal footing.
I think that everybody was in the same boat. Everybody was doing the same thing. Everybody was trying to cut trees and build houses and you know, produce crops and survive. The settlement that was northwest of Otterville was the largest, and there were enough blacks there to establish a school. Very soon after they came, the Canada Mission and other organizations helped to provide teachers. And the school records, it was SS number 18. The school records indicate that it was a comparable school to the rest of the township. It was first class, it had a first class teacher, and it had a large number of students. They had their own church, which they built in 1856. And they built that just north of Otterville, opposite the Anglican church at the time. But they were famous for their camp meetings.
Large groups of people, and the numbers I've seen were over 1,000, getting together for 2 or 3 days, camping out in tents, and it would be a religious meeting that would go on for 2 or 3 days with singing and preaching and testifying, and everybody there together, probably staying up half the night, doing hymn sings or whatever else. But according to the newspapers, the attendance at these things was not just black, not just white. It was a mixed attendance.
I think at first people were very happy and glad that they escaped such horrendous conditions in the States as slaves. But by the time they came here, I think that novelty sort of worn off, and they were mistreated. A lot of them were denied services in restaurants and stagecoach, steamboats. In terms of Oxford County, they probably weren't treated that well. And I think that's where a lot of them did leave. If they did have employment, the pay was very low. So a lot of them probably would have left to go on to larger cities where they wouldn't, where they'd probably get more money for their employment.
The slaves who had come through Ingersoll had also been led to safety by the Quakers. They were concealed in a church until suitable quarters were found for them.
They were able to escape from slavery, to go to Ingersoll, to hide up in the attic of the church. The next morning, they'll be taking through carriages to other farms where they'd be probably stay and work.
Soon, the blacks of Ingersoll felt the need to build their own church, and the British Episcopal Church was built in 1858. Some of the blacks remained in Ingersoll for 30 years, but gradually left for other settlements such as Dresden, Hamilton, St. Catharines, and Toronto. When the slaves were freed after the American Civil War, many returned to the USA.
There's very little left to see. The one thing that you can go and look at, which is actually, I find quite touching, is the African Methodist Episcopal Cemetery. And it's got one stone in it. You can see the gate with the name of the cemetery over it. It had been attached to a church next door. And it's in a beautiful grove of trees. And it's a quiet place, and it's really nicely maintained. And what always strikes me there is think about the people who are lying there, and they ended up in Oxford County, ended up in Otterville, and look around and just wonder where they started out.
Oops. Okay, thank you very much. I just want to thank everyone for watching my presentation. And if you want more information, you can visit my website at heathershistoricals.weebly.com. Thank you again. Bye-bye.